Part 2 of The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner. His grin softened a little bit into just the hint of a smile. His eyes were wide like mine, all awe and lights. He touched my face the way he'd touched my hand, as if he was trying to understand the shine. "So pretty," he said. He left his hand against my cheek. I'm not sure how long we stood there, smiling like total idiots, blazing away like glass torches. The inlet was empty of boats, which was probably good. No way even a mud-eyed human would have missed us. Not that they could have done anything to us, but I wasn't thirsty, and all the screaming would have ruined the mood. Eventually, a thick cloud drifted in front of the sun. Suddenly, we were just us again, though still slightly luminous. Not enough that anyone with eyes duller than a vampire's would notice. As soon as the shine was gone, my thoughts cleared up, and I could think about what was coming next. But even though Diego looked like his normal self again, not made of blazing light anyway, I knew he would never look the same to me. That tingly sensation in the pit of my stomach was still there. I had the feeling it might be there permanently. "Do we tell Riley? Do we think he doesn't know?" I asked. Diego sighed and dropped his hand. "I don't know. Let's think about this while we track them. We're going to have to be careful tracking them in the day. We're kind of noticeable in the sunlight, you know." He grinned. "Let's be ninjas." I nodded. Super secret ninja club sounds way cooler than the whole BFF thing. Definitely better. It didn't take us more than a few seconds to find the point from which the whole gang had left the island. That was the easy part. Finding where they'd touched ground on the mainland was a whole other problem. We briefly discussed splitting up, then vetoed that idea unanimously. Our logic was really sound. After all, if one of us found something, how would we tell the other? But mostly I just didn't want to leave him, and I could see he felt the same. Both of us had been without any kind of good companionship our whole lives, and it was just too sweet to waste a minute of it. There were so many options as to where they could have gone, to the mainland of the peninsula, or to another island, or back to the outskirts of Seattle, or north to Canada. Whenever we pulled down or burned down one of our houses, Riley was always prepared. He always seemed to know exactly where to go next. He must have planned ahead for that stuff, but he didn't let any of us in on the plan. They could have been anywhere. Ducking in and out of the water to avoid boats and people really slowed us down. We spent all day with no luck, but neither of us minded. We were having the most fun we'd ever had. It was such a strange day. Instead of sitting miserably in the darkness, trying to tune out the mayhem and swallow my disgust at my hiding place, I was playing ninja with my new best friend. Or maybe something more. We laughed a lot while we moved through the patches of shade, throwing rocks at each other like they were Chinese stars. Then the sun set, and suddenly I was stressed. Would Riley look for us? Would he assume we were fried? Did he know better? We started moving faster, a lot faster. We'd already circled all the nearby islands, so now we concentrated on the mainland. About an hour after sundown, I caught a familiar scent, and within seconds we were on their trail. Once we found the path of the smell, it was as easy as following a herd of elephants through fresh snow. We talked about what to do, more serious now as we ran. "I don't think we should tell Riley," I said. "Let's say we spent all day in your cave before we went looking for them." As I spoke, my paranoia started to grow. "Better yet, let's tell them your cave was filled with water. We couldn't even talk." "You think Riley's a bad dude, don't you?" he asked quietly after a minute. As he spoke, he took my hand. "I don't know, but I'd rather act like he was, just in case." I hesitated, then said, "You don't want to think he's bad." "No," Diego admitted. "He's kind of my friend. I mean, not like you're my friend." He squeezed my fingers, but more than anyone else. "I don't want to think..." Diego didn't finish his sentence. I squeezed his fingers back. "Maybe he's totally decent. Our being careful doesn't change who he is." "True. Okay, the underwater cave story it is. At least at first. I could talk to him about the sun later. I'd rather do it during the day anyway, when I can prove what I'm claiming right away. And just in case he already knows, but there's some good reason why he told us something else, I should tell him when we're alone. grab him at dawn when he's coming back from wherever it is he goes. I noticed a ton of I's rather than we's going on in Diego's little speech, and it bothered me. But at the same time, I didn't want much to do with educating Riley. I didn't have the same faith in him Diego did. "Ninja attack at dawn," I said to make him laugh. It worked. We started joking again as we tracked our herd of vampires, but I could tell he was thinking serious stuff under the teasing, just like I was. And I only got more anxious as we ran, because we were running fast, and there was no way we had the wrong trail, but it was taking too long. We were really getting away from the coast, up and over the closest mountains off into new territory. This wasn't the normal pattern. Every house we'd borrowed, whether it was up a mountain or on an island or hidden in a big farm, had a few things in common: the dead owners, the remote locale, and one other thing. They were all sort of focused on Seattle, oriented around the big city like orbiting moons. Seattle was always the hub, always the target. But we were out of orbit now, and it felt wrong. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just so that so many things were changing today. All the truths I'd accepted had been turned upside down, and I wasn't in the mood for any other upheavals. Why couldn't Riley have just picked someplace normal? "Funny they're this far out," Diego murmured, and I could hear the edge in his voice. "Or scary," I muttered. He squeezed my hand. "It's cool. The Ninja Club can handle anything. We got a secret handshake yet?" "Working on it," he promised. Something started to bug me. It was like I could feel this strange blind spot. I knew there was something I wasn't seeing, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Something obvious. And then, about 60 miles farther west than our usual perimeter, we found the house. It was impossible to mistake the noise. The boom, boom, boom of the bass. The video game soundtrack. The snarling. Totally our crowd. I pulled my hand free, and Diego looked at me. "Hey, I don't even know you," I said in a joking tone. "I haven't had one conversation with you. What with all the water we sat in all day, you could be a ninja or a vampire for all I know." He grinned. "Same goes for you, stranger." Then low and fast. "Just do the same things you did yesterday. Tomorrow night we'll get out together. Maybe do some reconnaissance. Figure out more of what's going on." "Sounds like a plan. Mum's the word." He ducked close and kissed me. Just a peck, but right on the lips. The shock of it zinged through my whole body. Then he said, "Let's do this," and headed down the side of the mountain toward the source of the raucous noise without looking back, already playing the part. A little stunned, I followed from a few yards behind, remembering to put the distance between us that I would put between myself and anyone else. The house was a big log cabin-style affair, tucked into a hollow in the pines with no sign of any neighbors for miles around. All the windows were black, as if the place were empty, but the whole frame was trembling from the heavy bass in the basement. Diego went in first, and I tried to move behind him, like he was Kevin or Raul, hesitant, protecting my space. He found the stairs and charged down with a confident tread. "Trying to lose me, losers?" he asked. "Oh hey, Diego's alive," I heard Kevin answer with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "No thanks to you," Diego said as I slipped into the dark basement. The only light came from the various TV screens, but it was way more than any of us needed. I hurried back to where Fred had a whole couch to himself, glad that it was right for me to look anxious because there was no way to hide. I swallowed hard as the revulsion hit and curled up in my usual spot on the floor behind the couch. Once I was down, Fred's repellent power seemed to ease up, or maybe I was just getting used to it. The basement was more than half empty since it was the middle of the night. All the kids in here had eyes the same as mine, bright, recently fed red. "Took me a while to clean up your stupid mess," Diego told Kevin. "It was almost dawn by the time I got to what was left of the house. Had to sit in a cave filled with water all day." "Go tattle to Riley, whatever." "I see the little girl made it too," said a new voice, and I shuddered because it was Raul. I felt a little bit of relief that he didn't know my name, but mostly I just felt horrified that he'd noticed me at all. "Yeah, she followed me." I couldn't see Diego, but I knew he was shrugging. "Aren't you the savior of the hour?" Raul said snidely. "We don't get extra points for being morons." I wished Diego wouldn't taunt Raul. I hoped Riley would come back soon. Only Riley could curb Raul even the littlest bit. But Riley was probably out hunting Dreg's kids to bring to her, or whatever else he did while he was away. Interesting attitude you got, Diego. You think that Riley likes you so much he's going to care if I kill you? I think you're wrong. But either way, for tonight, he already thinks you're dead. I could hear the others moving, some probably to back Raul up, others just getting out of the way. I hesitated in my hiding spot, knowing I wasn't going to let Diego fight them alone, but worried about blowing our cover if it didn't come to that. I hoped Diego had survived this long because he had some crazy combat skills. I wasn't going to have much to offer in that department. There were 3 members of Raul's gang here, and some others that might help out just to get on his good side. Would Riley come home before they had time to burn us? Diego's voice was calm when he answered. You're really that afraid to take me on alone? Typical. Raul snorted. Does that ever work? I mean, besides in movies. Why should I take you on alone? I don't care about beating you. I just want to end you. I rolled into a crouch, tensed to spring. Raul kept talking. He liked the sound of his own voice a lot. But it's not going to take all of us to deal with you. These 2 will take care of the other evidence of your unfortunate survival, little what's-her-name. My body felt icy, frozen solid. I tried to shake it off so that I could fight my best. Not that it would have made a difference. And then I felt something else. Something totally unexpected. A wave of revulsion so overpowering that I couldn't hold my crouch. I crumpled to the floor, gasping with horror. I was not the only one to react. I heard disgusted snarls and retching sounds from every corner of the basement. A few people retreated to the edges of the room where I could see them. They strained against the wall, stretching their necks away as if they could escape the horrible feeling. At least one of these was a member of Raul's gang. I heard Raul's distinctive growl, and then heard it fade as he took off up the stairs. He wasn't the only one to make a break for it. About half of the vampires in the basement cleared out. I didn't have that choice. I could barely move. And then I realized this had to be because I was so close to Freaky Fred. He was responsible for what was happening, and as horrible as I felt, I was still able to realize that he'd probably just saved my life. Why? The sensation of disgust faded slowly, as soon as I could, I crept to the edge of the couch and took in the aftermath. All of Raul's gang was gone, but Diego was still there on the far end of the big room by the TVs. The vampires who remained were slowly relaxing, though everybody looked a little shaken. Most of them were shooting cautious glances in Fred's direction. I peeked at the back of his head, too, though I couldn't see anything. I looked away quickly. Looking at Fred brought back some of the nausea. Keep it down, the deep voice came from Fred. I'd never heard him speak before. Everyone stared and then looked away immediately as the revulsion returned. So Fred just wanted his peace and quiet. Well, whatever. I was alive because of it. Most likely Raul would get distracted by some other irritant before dawn and take out his anger on someone close by. And Riley always came back at the end of the night. He would hear that Diego had been in his cave rather than outside and destroyed by the sun, and Raul wouldn't have an excuse to attack him or me. At least, that was the best-case scenario. In the meantime, maybe Diego and I could come up with some plan to steer clear of Raul. Again, I had a fleeting sense that I was missing an obvious solution. Before I could figure it out, my thoughts were interrupted. Sorry. The deep, almost silent mutter could only have come from Fred. It looked like I was the only one close enough to really hear. Was he talking to me? I looked at him again and felt nothing. I couldn't see his face. He had his back to me still. He had thick, wavy blonde hair. I'd never noticed that before. Not with all the days I'd sat hiding in his shadow. Riley wasn't kidding when he'd said that Fred was special. Gross, but really special. Did Riley have any idea that Fred was so powerful? He was able to overwhelm a whole room of us in a second. Though I couldn't see his expression, I had the sense that Fred was waiting for an answer. Don't apologize, I breathed almost silently. Thank you. Fred shrugged, and then I found I couldn't look at him anymore. The hours passed slower than usual as I waited for Raul to come back. From time to time, I tried to look at Fred again, to see past the protection he'd created for himself. But I always found myself repelled. If I tried too hard, I ended up gagging. Thinking about Fred was a good distraction from thinking about Diego. I tried to pretend I didn't care where he was in the room. I didn't look at him, but focused on the sound of his breathing, his distinct rhythm, to keep tabs. He sat on the other side of the room from me, listening to his CDs on a laptop, or maybe pretending to listen the way I was pretending to read books from the damp backpack on my shoulders. I flipped the pages at my usual rate, but I didn't take anything in. I was waiting for Raul. Luckily, Riley came first. Raul and his cohorts were right behind him, not as loud and obnoxious as usual. Maybe Fred had taught them a little respect. Probably not, though. More likely, Fred had just anchored them. I really hoped Fred never let his guard slip. Riley went to Diego right away. I listened with my back to them, eyes on my book. In my peripheral vision, I saw some of Raul's idiots wandering, looking for their favorite games or whatever they'd been doing before Fred had driven them out. Kevin was one of them, but he seemed to be looking for something more specific than entertainment. Several times his eyes tried to focus on where I was sitting, but Fred's aura kept him at bay. He gave up after a few minutes, looking a little sick. "I heard you made it back," Riley said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I can always count on you, Diego." "No problem," Diego said in a relaxed voice. "Unless you count holding my breath all day as a negative." Riley laughed. "Don't cut it so close next time. Set a better example for the babies." Diego just laughed with him. From the corner of my eye, it seemed like Kevin relaxed some. Was he really worried about Diego getting him in trouble? Maybe Riley listened to Diego more than I realized. I wondered whether that was why Raul had gotten crazy before. Was it a good thing if Diego was that in with Riley after all? Maybe Riley was okay. That relationship didn't compromise what we had, did it? Time didn't pass any faster after the sun was up. It was crowded and unstable in the basement, like every day. If vampires could get hoarse, Riley would have lost his voice entirely from the yelling. A couple of kids temporarily lost limbs, but nobody got torched. The music warred with the game tracks, and I was glad I didn't get headaches. I tried reading my books, but I ended up just flipping through one after the other, not caring enough to make my eyes focus on the words. I left them in a neat stack by the end of the couch for Fred. I always left my books for him, though I could never tell if he actually read them. Couldn't look at him closely enough to see what exactly he did with his time. At least Raul never looked my way. Neither did Kevin or any of the others. My hiding place was as effective as ever. I couldn't see if Diego was smart enough to ignore me, because I was ignoring him so thoroughly. No one could suspect that we were a team, except maybe Fred. Had Fred been paying attention as I prepared to fight alongside Diego? Even if he had, I didn't worry too much about it. If Fred felt any particular ill will toward me, he could have let me die last night. Would have been easy. It got louder as the sun started to go down. We couldn't see the light fading here underground, with all of the windows upstairs covered just in case, but waiting through so many long days gave you a good sense for when it was almost over. Kids started getting antsy, bugging Riley about whether they could go out. "Christy, you were out last night," Riley said, and you could hear the patience wearing thin in his voice. "Heather, Jim, Logan, go ahead. Warren, your eyes are dark, so go with them. Hey, Sarah, I'm not blind. Get back here." The kids he shut down sulked in the corners, some of them waiting for Riley to leave so they could sneak out in spite of his rules. Fred, must be about your turn," Riley said, not looking in our direction. I heard Fred sigh as he got to his feet. Everyone cringed as he moved through the center of the room, even Riley. But unlike the others, Riley smiled a little to himself. He liked his vampire with skills. I felt naked with Fred gone. Anyone could focus on me now. I held perfectly still, head down, doing everything in my power not to call attention to myself. Lucky for me, Riley was in a hurry tonight. He barely paused to glare at the people who were clearly edging for the door, let alone threaten them, as he headed out himself. Normally, he'd give us some variant on the usual speech about keeping a low profile, but not tonight. He seemed preoccupied, anxious. I'd have bet he was going to see her. That made me less excited about catching up with him at dawn. I waited for Christy and 3 of her usual companions to head out, and I slipped out in their wake, trying to look like part of the entourage without irritating them. I didn't look at Raul. I didn't look at Diego. I concentrated on seeming inconsequential. No one to notice. Just some random vampire chick. Once we were out of the house, I split off from Christy immediately and beat it into the woods. I hoped only Diego would care enough to follow my scent. Halfway up the side of the nearest mountain, I made my perch in the top branches of a big spruce that cleared its neighbors by several meters. I had a pretty good view of anyone who might try to track me. Turns out I was being overcautious. Maybe I'd been too cautious all day. Diego was the only one to come looking. I saw him from a distance and backtracked to meet him. "Long day," he said, giving me a hug. "Your plan is hard." I hugged him back, marveling at how comfortable this was. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. "Sorry about Raul. That was close." I nodded. "Good thing Fred is so disgusting. Wonder if Riley knows how potent that kid is." "I doubt it. I've never seen him do that before, and I spend a lot of time around him." "Well, that's Freaky Fred's business. We have our own secret to tell Riley." I shuddered. "Still not sure that's a good idea. We won't know until we see how Riley reacts." I don't really like not knowing, as a general rule. Diego's eyes narrowed speculatively. "How do you feel about adventure?" "Depends. Well, I was thinking about club priorities, about finding out as much as we can. And I think we should follow Riley, find out what he's doing." I stared, "But he'll know we tracked him. He'll catch our scents." "I know. This is how I figure it. I follow his scent, you keep clear by a few 100 yards, and follow my sound. Then Riley only knows I followed him, and I can tell him it's because I had something important to share. That's when I do the big reveal with the disco ball effect, and I'll see what he says." His eyes narrowed as he examined me. "But you just play it close to the chest for now, okay? I'll tell you if he's cool about it." "What if he comes back early from wherever he's going? Don't you want it to be close to dawn so you can glitter?" "Yes, that's definitely a possible problem, and it might affect the way the conversation goes. But I think we should risk it. He seemed like he was in a hurry tonight, didn't he? Like maybe he needs all night for whatever he's doing." "Maybe, or maybe he's just in a big hurry to see her, We might not want to surprise him if she's nearby." We both winced. "True. Still," he frowned. "Doesn't it feel like whatever's coming is getting close? Like we might not have forever to figure this out?" I nodded unhappily. "Yeah, it does. So let's take our chances. Riley trusts me, and I have a good reason for wanting to talk to him." I thought about this strategy. Though I'd only known him for a day, really, I was still aware that this level of paranoia was out of character for Diego. "This elaborate plan of yours," I said. "What about it?" he asked. "It sounds kind of like a solo plan, not so much a club adventure, at least not when it comes to the dangerous part." He made a face that told me I'd caught him. "This is my idea. I'm the one who," he hesitated, having trouble with the next word, "trusts Riley. I'm the only one who's going to risk getting on his bad side if I'm wrong." Chicken as I was, this didn't fly with me. Clubs don't work that way. He nodded, his expression unclear. "Okay, we'll think about it as we go." I didn't think he really meant it. "Stay in the trees. Track me from above, 'kay?" he said. "Okay." I headed back toward the log cabin, moving fast. I followed through the branches, most of them so close-packed that I only rarely had to really leap from one tree to another. I kept my movements as small as possible, hoping that the bending of the boughs under my weight would just look like wind. It was a breezy night, which would help. It was cold for summer, not that the temperature bothered me. Diego caught Riley's scent outside the house without trouble and then loped after it quickly while I trailed several yards back and about 100 yards north, higher on the slope than he was. When the trees were really thick, he'd rustle a trunk now and again so I wouldn't lose him. We kept on, with him running and me impersonating a flying squirrel for only 15 minutes or so before I saw Diego slow down. We must have been getting close. I moved higher in the branches, looking for a tree with a good view. I scaled one that towered over its neighbors and scanned the scene. Less than half a mile away was a large gap in the trees, an open field that covered several acres. Near the center of the space, closer to the trees on its east side, was what looked like an oversized gingerbread house. Painted bright pink, green, and white, it was elaborate to the point of ridiculousness, with fancy trim and finials on every conceivable edge. It was the kind of thing I would have laughed at in a more relaxed situation. Riley was nowhere in sight, but Diego had come to a complete stop below, so I assumed this was the endpoint of our pursuit. Maybe this was the replacement house Riley was preparing for when the big log cabin crumbled, except that it was smaller than any of the other houses we'd stayed in, and it didn't look like it had a basement. And it was even farther away from Seattle than the last one. Diego looked up at me, and I signaled for him to join me. He nodded and retraced his trail a little ways. Then he made an enormous leap, and I wondered if I could have jumped that high, even as young and strong as I was, and caught a branch about halfway up the closest tree. Unless someone was extraordinarily vigilant, no one would ever have noticed that Diego had made a side trip off his path. Even still, he jumped around in the treetops, making sure his trail did not lead directly to mine. When he finally decided it was safe to join me, he took my hand right away. Silently, I nodded toward the gingerbread house. One corner of his mouth twitched. Simultaneously, we started edging toward the east side of the house, keeping high up in the trees. We got as close as we dared, leaving a few trees as cover between the house and ourselves. And then we sat, silently, listening. The breeze turned helpfully gentle, and we could hear something, strange little brushing, ticking sounds. At first I didn't recognize what I was hearing, but then Diego twitched another little smile, puckered his lips, and silently kissed the air in my direction. Kissing didn't sound the same with vampires as it did with humans. No soft, fleshy, liquid-filled cells to squish against each other, just stone lips, no give. I heard one kiss between vampires before, Diego's touch to my lips last night, but I never would have made the connection. It was so far from what I'd expected to find here. This knowledge spun everything around in my head. I had assumed Riley was going to see her. Whether to receive instructions or bring her new recruits, I didn't know, but I never imagined stumbling across some kind of love nest. How could Riley kiss her? I shuddered and glanced at Diego. He looked faintly horrified too, but he shrugged. I thought back to that last night of humanity, flinching as I remembered the vivid burning. I tried to recall the moments just before that, through all the fuzziness. First, there was the creeping fear that had built as Riley pulled up to the dark house. The feeling of safety I'd had in the bright burger joint dissolving entirely. I was holding back, edging away, and then he'd grabbed my arm with a steel grip and yanked me out of the car like I was a doll, weightless. Terror and disbelief as he leaped the 10 yards to the door. Terror and then pain, leaving no room for disbelief as he broke my arm, dragging me through the door into the black house. And then the voice. As I focused on the memory, I could hear it again. High and sing-song like a little girl's, but grouchy, a child throwing a tantrum. I remembered what she'd said. Why did you even bring this one? It's too small. Something close to that, I thought. The words might not be exactly right, but that was the meaning. I was sure Riley had sounded eager to please when he answered, afraid of disappointing. But she's another body, another distraction at least. I think I'd whimpered then, and he'd shaken me painfully. But he'd spoken to me again. I was like a dog, not a person. This whole night has been a waste, the child's voice had complained. I've killed them all. Ugh. I remembered that the house had shuddered then, as if a car had collided with the frame. I realized now that she'd probably just kicked something in frustration. Fine, I guess even a little one is better than nothing. If this is the best you can do, and I'm so full now that I should be able to stop. Riley's hard fingers had disappeared then and left me alone with the voice. I'd been too panicked at this point to make a sound. I'd just closed my eyes, though I was already totally blind in the darkness. I didn't scream until something cut into my neck, burning like a blade coated in acid. I cringed back from the memory, trying to push the next part from my mind. Instead, I concentrated on that short conversation. She hadn't sounded like she was talking to her lover, or even a friend, more like she was talking to an employee. One she didn't like much and might fire soon. But the strange vampire kissing sounds continued. Someone sighed in contentment. I frowned at Diego. This exchange didn't tell us much. How long did we need to stay? He just held his head on the side, listening carefully. And after a few more minutes of patience, the low, romantic sounds were suddenly interrupted. How many? The voice was muted by distance, but still distinct and recognizable. High, almost a trill, like a spoiled young girl. 22, Riley answered, sounding proud. Diego and I exchanged a sharp glance. There were 22 of us at last count anyway. They must be talking about us. I thought I'd lost 2 more to the sun, but one of my older kids is obedient. Riley continued. There was almost an affectionate sound to his voice when he spoke of Diego as one of his kids. He has an underground place. He hid himself with the younger one. Are you sure? There was a long pause, this time with no sounds of romance. Even from this distance, I thought I could feel some tension. Yeah, he's a good kid, I'm sure. Another strained pause. I didn't hear her question. What did she mean, are you sure? Did she think he'd heard the story from someone else rather than seeing Diego for himself? 22 is good, she mused, with the tension seeming to dissolve. How is their behavior developing? Some of them are almost a year old. Do they still follow the normal patterns? Yes, Riley said. Everything you told me to do worked flawlessly. They don't think, they just do what they've always done. I can always distract them with thirst. It keeps them under control. I frowned at Diego. Riley didn't want us to think. Why? You've done so well, our creator cooed, and there was another kiss. 22! Is it time? Riley asked eagerly. Her answer came back fast, like a slap. No, I haven't decided when. I don't understand. You don't need to. It's enough for you to know that our enemies have great powers. We cannot be too careful. Her voice softened, turned sugary again. But all 22 still alive, even with what they are capable of. What good will it be against 22? She let out a tinkling little laugh. Diego and I had not looked away from each other throughout all of this, and I could see in his eyes now that his thoughts were the same as mine. Yes, we'd been created for a purpose, as we'd guessed. We had an enemy, or our creator had an enemy. Did the distinction matter? Decisions, she muttered. Not yet. Maybe one more handful, just to be sure. Adding more might actually decrease our numbers, Riley cautioned hesitantly, as if being careful not to upset her. It's always unstable when a new group is introduced. True, she agreed, and I imagined Riley sighing in relief that she was not upset. Abruptly, Diego looked away from me, staring out across the meadow. I hadn't heard any movement from the house, but maybe she had come out. My head whipped around at the same time the rest of me had turned to a statue, and I saw what had started Diego. 4 figures were crossing the open field to the house. They had entered the clearing from the west, the point farthest from where we hid. They all wore long, dark cloaks with deep hoods, so at first I thought they were people. Weird people, but just humans all the same, because none of the vampires I knew had matching goth clothes, and none moved in a way that was so smooth and controlled and elegant. But then I realized that none of the humans I'd ever seen could move that way either, and what's more, they couldn't do it so quietly. The dark cloaks skimmed across the long grass in absolute silence, so either these were vampires, or they were something else supernatural. Ghosts, maybe. But if they were vampires I didn't know, and that meant they might very well be these enemies she was talking about. If so, we should get the hell out of Dodge right now, because we didn't have 20 other vampires on our side at the moment. I almost took off then, but I was too afraid to draw the attention of the cloaked figures, so I watched them move slowly forward, noticing other things about them. How they stayed in a perfect diamond formation that never was the slightest bit out of line, no matter how the terrain changed under their feet. How the one at the point of the diamond was much smaller than the others, and its cloak was darker, too. How they didn't seem to be tracking their way in, not trying to follow the path of any scent. They simply knew their way. Maybe they were invited. They moved directly toward the house, and I felt like it might be safe to breathe again when they started silently up the steps toward the front door. They weren't coming straight for Diego and me, at least. When they were out of sight, we could disappear into the sound of the next breeze through the trees, and they would never know we'd been here. I looked at Diego and twitched my head slightly toward the way we'd come. He narrowed his eyes and held up one finger. Oh, great. He wanted to stay. I rolled my eyes at him. Though I was so afraid, I was surprised I was capable of sarcasm. We both looked back at the house. The cloaked things had let themselves in silently, but I realized that neither she nor Riley had spoken since we caught sight of the visitors. They must have heard something or known in some other way that they were in danger. Don't bother, a very clear monotone voice commanded lazily. It was not as high-pitched as our creator's, but it still sounded girlish to me. I think you know who we are, so you must know that there is no point in trying to surprise us, or hide from us, or fight us, or run. A deep, masculine chuckle that did not belong to Riley echoed menacingly through the house. "Relax," instructed the first, inflectionless voice, the cloaked girl. Her voice had that distinctive ring that made me certain she was a vampire, not a ghost or any other kind of nightmare. "We're not here to destroy you. Yet." There was a moment of silence, and then some barely audible movements. A shifting of positions. "If you're not here to kill us, then what?" our creator asked, strained and shrill. "We seek to know your intentions here, specifically if they involve a certain local clan," the cloaked girl explained. "We wonder if they have anything to do with the mayhem you've created here, illegally created." Diego and I frowned simultaneously. None of this made sense, but the last part was the weirdest. What could be illegal for vampires? What cop, what judge, what prison could have power over us? "Yes," our creator hissed. "My plans are all about them, but we can't move yet. It's tricky." A petulant note crept into her voice at the end. "Trust me, we know the difficulties better than you. It is remarkable that you've managed to keep off the radar, so to speak, for this long. Tell me," a hint of interest colored the monotone, "how are you doing it?" Our creator hesitated, and then spoke all in a rush, almost as if there had been some silent intimidation. "I haven't made the decision," she spit out, and then she added more slowly, unwillingly, "to attack. I've never decided to do anything with them." "Rough, but effective," the cloak girl said. "Unfortunately, your period of deliberation has come to a close. You must decide, now, what you will do with your little army." Both Diego's and my eyes widened at that word. "Otherwise, it will be our duty to punish you as the law demands. This reprieve, however short, troubles me. It is not our way. I suggest you give us what assurances you can, quickly." "We'll go at once," Riley volunteered anxiously, and there was a sharp hiss. "We'll go as soon as possible," our creator amended furiously. "There is much to do. I assume you wish us to succeed. Then I must have a little time to get them trained, instructed, fed." There was a short pause. 5 days. We will come for you then, and there is no rock you can hide under, or speed at which you can flee that will save you. If you have not made your attack by the time we come, you will burn." This was said with no menace other than an absolute certainty. "And if I have made my attack?" our creator asked, shaken. "We'll see," the cloaked girl answered in a brighter tone than she'd used yet. "I suppose that all depends on how successful you are. Work hard to please us." The last command was given in a flat, hard pitch that made me feel a strange chill in the center of my body. "Yes," our creator snarled. "Yes," Riley echoed in a whisper. A second later, the cloaked vampires were noiselessly exiting the house. Neither Diego nor I so much as took a breath for 5 minutes as they disappeared. Inside the house, our creator and Riley were just as quiet. Another 10 minutes passed in total stillness. I touched Diego's arm. This was our chance to get out of here. At the moment, I wasn't so afraid of Riley anymore. I wanted to get as far away as I could from those dark cloaks. I wanted the safety of numbers waiting back at the log cabin, and I figured that was exactly how our creator felt too. Why she'd made so many of us in the first place. There were some things out there scarier than I'd imagined. Diego hesitated, still listening, and a second later his patience was rewarded. "Well," she whispered inside the house, "now they know." Was she talking about the cloaks or the mysterious clan? Which one was the enemy she'd mentioned before the drama? "That doesn't matter. We outnumber—" "Any warning matters," she growled, cutting him off. "There is so much to do. Only 5 days," she groaned. "No more messing around. You start tonight." "I won't fail you," Riley promised. Crap. Diego and I moved at the same time, leaping from our perch into the next tree over, flying back the way we'd come. Riley was in a hurry now, and if he found Diego's trail after all that had just passed with the cloaks and no Diego there at the end of it— "I've got to get back and be waiting," Diego whispered to me as we raced. "Lucky it's not in view of the house. Don't want him to know I heard." "We should talk to him together." "Too late for that. He'd noticed that your scent wasn't on the trail. Looks suspicious." "Diego." He trapped me into sitting this one out. We were back at the spot where he'd joined me. He spoke in a rushed whisper. "Stick to the plan, Bree. I'll tell him what I plan to tell him. It's not close to dawn, but that's just how it has to be. If he doesn't believe me," Diego shrugged, "he's got bigger things to worry about than me having an overactive imagination. Maybe he'll be more likely to listen now. Looks like we need all the help we can get, and being able to move around in the day can't hurt." "Diego," I repeated, not knowing what else to say. He looked into my eyes, and I waited for his lips to twitch into that easy smile, for him to make some joke about ninjas or BFFs. He didn't. Instead, he leaned in slowly, never moving his eyes from mine, and kissed me. His smooth lips pressed against mine for one long second while we stared at each other. Then he leaned away and sighed. "Get home. Hide behind Fred and act clueless. I'll be right behind you. Be careful." I grabbed his hand and squeezed it hard, then let go. Riley had spoken of Diego affectionately. I would have hoped that affection was real. There wasn't another choice. Diego disappeared into the trees, quiet as a rustling breeze. I didn't waste time looking after him. I sprinted through the branches in a direct line back to the house. I hoped my eyes were still bright enough from the last night's meal to explain my absence. Just a quick hunt. Got lucky. Found a lone hiker. Nothing out of the ordinary. The sound of the thudding music that greeted my approach was accompanied by the unmistakable sweet, smoky scent of a burning vampire. My panic went into overdrive. I could just as easily die inside the house as outside, but there was no other way. I didn't slow, just rushed down the stairs straight to the corner where I could barely make out Freaky Fred standing. Looking for something to do? Tired of sitting? I had no idea what he was up to, and I didn't care. I would stick tight to him until Riley and Diego got back. In the middle of the floor was a smoldering heap that was too big to be just an arm and a leg. So much for Riley's 22. No one seemed terribly concerned about the smoking remains. That sight was too common. As I hurried closer to Fred, for once the sense of disgust didn't get stronger. Instead, it faded. He didn't seem to notice me, just went on reading the book he'd held, one of those I'd left for him a few days ago. I had no problem seeing what he was doing now that I was close to where he was leaning against the back of the couch. I hesitated, wondering why that was. Could he turn his nausea thing off when he wanted? Did that mean we were both unprotected right now? At least Raul wasn't home yet, thankfully, though Kevin was. For the first time ever, I really saw what Fred looked like. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with thick, curly blonde hair I'd noticed once before. He was broad-shouldered and muscular. He looked older than most of the other kids, like a college student, not a high school kid. And this was the part that surprised me for some reason. He was good-looking, as handsome as anyone else, maybe even handsomer than most. I didn't know why that was so trippy for me. I guess just because I always associated him with revulsion? I felt weird for staring. I glanced quickly around the room to see if anyone else had noticed that Fred was normal, and pretty, for the moment. No one was looking our way. I stole a fast peek at Kevin, ready to shift my focus at once if he noticed, but his eyes were concentrated on some point to the left of where we stood. He was frowning slightly. Before I could look away, his gaze skipped right over me and settled on my right side. His frown deepened, like he was trying to see me and couldn't. I felt the corners of my mouth twitch into not quite a grin. There was too much to worry about to really enjoy Kevin's blindness. I looked back at Fred, wondering if the gross-out factor would return, only to see that he was smiling with me. Smiling. He was really spectacular. Then the moment was over, and Fred went back to his book. I didn't move for a while, waiting for something to happen. For Diego to come through the door, or Riley with Diego, or Raul. For the nausea to hit again, or for Kevin to glare in my direction, or for the next fright to break out. Something. When nothing did, I eventually pulled myself together and did what I should have been doing, pretending nothing unusual was going on. I grabbed a book from the pile near Fred's feet and then sat down right there and acted like I was reading. It was probably one of the books I'd pretended to read yesterday, but it didn't look familiar. I flipped through the pages, again taking nothing in. My mind was racing around in tight little circles. Where was Diego? How had Riley reacted to his story? What had it all meant? The talk before the cloaks? The talk after the cloaks? I worked through it, going backward, trying to assemble the pieces into a recognizable picture. The vampire world had some kind of police, and they were damn scary. This wild group of months-old vampires was supposed to be an army, and this army was somehow illegal. Our creator, had an enemy. Strike that, 2 enemies. We were going to attack one of them in 5 days, or else the other ones, the scary cloaks, were going to attack her, or us, or both. We would be trained for this attack as soon as Riley got back. I snuck a glance at the door, then forced my eyes back to the page in front of me. And then the stuff before the visitors. She was worrying about some decision. She was pleased that she had so many vampires, so many soldiers. Riley was happy that Diego and I had survived. He said he thought he'd lost 2 more to the sun, so that must mean he didn't know how vampires really reacted to sunlight. What she'd said was strange, though. She'd asked if he was sure Diego had survived, or sure that Diego's story was true. The last thought frightened me. Did she already know that the sun didn't hurt us? If she did know, then why had she lied to Riley, and through him to us? Why would she want to keep us in the dark, literally? Was it very important to her that we stay ignorant? Important enough to get Diego in trouble? I was working myself into a real panic, frozen solid. If I still could sweat, I would have been sweating now. I had to refocus, to turn the next page, to keep my eyes down. Was Riley deceived, or was he in on it too? When Riley said that he'd lost 2 more to the sun, did he mean the sun literally, or the lie about the sun? If it was the second option, then to know the truth meant being lost. Panic scattered my thoughts. I tried to be rational and make sense of it. It was harder without Diego, having someone to talk to interact with, sharpened my ability to concentrate. Without that, fear sucked at the edges of my thoughts, twisted with the always present thirst. The lure of blood was constantly close to the surface, and even now, decently well fed, I could feel the burn and the need. Think about her. Think about Riley, I told myself. I had to understand why they would lie, if they were lying, so that I could try to figure out what it would mean to them that Diego knew their secret. If they hadn't lied, if they'd just told us all that the day was as safe for us as the night, how would that change things? I imagined what it would be like if we didn't have to be contained in a blacked-out basement all day. If the 21 of us, maybe fewer now, depending on how the hunting parties were getting along, were free to do what we wanted whenever we wanted to. We would want to hunt, that was a given. If we didn't have to come back, if we didn't have to hide, well, maybe many of us wouldn't come back very regularly. It was hard to focus on the return while the thirst was in charge, but Riley had drilled so deeply into all of us the threat of burning, of a return of that hideous pain we'd all experienced once. That was the reason we could stop ourselves, self-preservation, the only instinct stronger than thirst. So the threat kept us together. There were other hiding places, like Diego's cave, but who else thought about that kind of thing? We had a place to go, a base, so we went to it. Clear heads were not a vampire specialty, or at least they weren't the specialty of young vampires. Riley was clear-headed. Diego was more clear-headed than I was. Those cloaked vampires were terrifyingly focused. I shuddered, so the routine wouldn't control us forever. What would they do when we were older? Clearer. It struck me that nobody was older than Riley. Everyone here was new. She needed a bunch of us now for this mystery enemy. But what about afterward? I had a strong feeling that I didn't want to be around for that part, and I suddenly realized something stupendously obvious. It was the solution that had tickled the edges of my understanding before, when I was tracking the vampire herd to this place with Diego. I didn't have to be around for that part. I didn't have to be around for one more night. I was a statue again as I thought over this stunning idea. If Diego and I hadn't known where the gang was most likely headed, would we have ever found them? Probably not. And that was a big group, leaving a wide trail. What if it were a single vampire, one who could leap up onto the land, maybe into a tree, without leaving a trail at the edge of the water? Just one, or maybe 2 vampires, who could swim out as far to sea as they wanted, who could return to any land anywhere. Canada, California, Chile, China. You would never be able to find those 2 vampires. They would be gone. Disappeared like they'd gone up in smoke. We didn't have to come back the other night. We shouldn't have. Why hadn't I thought of it then? But would Diego have agreed? I was abruptly not so sure of myself. Was Diego more loyal to Riley after all? Would he have felt it Was his responsibility to stand by Riley? He'd known Riley a lot longer. He'd really only known me a day. Was he closer to Riley than he was to me? I pondered that, frowning. Well, I would find out as soon as we had a minute alone, and then maybe, if our secret club really meant something, it wouldn't matter what our creator had planned for us. We could disappear, and Riley would have to make do with 19 vampires. Or make some new ones quick. Either way, not our problem. I couldn't wait to tell Diego my plan. My gut instinct was that he would feel the same. Hopefully. Suddenly, I wondered if this was what had really happened to Shelley and Steve, and the other kids who had disappeared. I knew they hadn't burned in the sun. Had Riley only claimed he'd seen their ashes as another way to keep the rest of us afraid and dependent on him? Returning home to him every dawn? Maybe Shelley and Steve had just set off on their own. No more Raul, no enemies or armies threatening their immediate future. Maybe that's what Riley had meant by lost to the sun. Runaways, in which case he'd be happy that Diego hadn't bailed, right? If only Diego and I had taken off. We could be free too, like Shelley and Steve. No rules, no fear of the sunrise. Again, I imagined a whole horde of us on the loose without a curfew. I could see Diego and me moving like ninjas through the shade. But I could also see Raul, Kevin, and the rest sparkling disco ball monsters in the center of a busy downtown street, the bodies piling up, the screaming, the helicopters whirring, the soft, helpless cops with their dinky little bullets that wouldn't make a dent, the cameras, the panic that would spread so fast as the pictures bounced swiftly around the globe. Vampires wouldn't be a secret for very long. Even Raul couldn't kill people fast enough to keep the story from spreading. There was a chain of logic here, and I tried to grasp it before I could be distracted again. 1. Humans didn't know about vampires. 2. Riley encouraged us to be inconspicuous, not to attract the notice of humans and educate them otherwise. 3. Diego and I had decided that all vampires must be following that guideline, or else the world would know about us. 4. They must have a reason for doing so, and it wasn't the little pop guns of the human police that motivated them. Yeah, the reason must be pretty important to make all vampires hide all day in stuffy basements. Maybe reason enough to make Riley and our creator lie to us, terrify us about the burning sun. Maybe it was a reason Riley would explain to Diego, and since it was so important, and he was so responsible, Diego would promise to keep the secret, and they would be cool with that. Surely they would. But what if what actually happened to Shelley and Steve was that they'd discovered the shiny skin thing and not run? What if they'd gone to Riley? And crap, there went the next step in my logical path. The chain dissolved, and I started panicking about Diego again. As I stressed, I realized that I'd been thinking things through for a while. I could feel dawn coming on, no more than an hour away. So where was Diego? Where was Riley? As I thought this, the door opened and Raul leaped down the stairs, laughing with his buddies. I hunched down, leaning closer to Fred. Raul didn't notice us. He looked at the crispy fried vampire in the center of the floor and laughed harder. His eyes were brilliant red. On the nights Raul went hunting, he never came home till he had to. He would keep feeding as long as he could, so dawn must have been even closer than I'd thought. Riley must have demanded that Diego prove his words. That was the only explanation. And they were waiting for the dawn, only that would mean that Riley didn't know the truth, that our creator was lying to him too. Or did it? My thoughts twisted up again. Christy showed up minutes later with 3 of her gang. She reacted indifferently to the pile of ashes. I did a quick head count as 2 more hunters hurried through the door. 20 vampires. Everyone was home except Diego and Riley. The sun would rise at any moment. The door at the top of the basement stairs creaked as someone opened it. I sprang to my feet. Riley entered. He shut the door behind him. He walked down the stairs. No one followed. Before I could process this, Riley roared out an animalistic shriek of rage. He was staring down at the ashy remains on the floor, his eyes bulging in fury. Everyone stood silent, immobile. We'd all seen Riley lose his temper, but this was something different. Riley spun and raked his fingers through a blaring speaker, then ripped it from the wall and hurled it across the room. Jen and Christy dodged out of the way as it exploded into the far wall, sending up a cloud of pulverized drywall dust. Riley smashed the sound system with his foot, and the thudding bass went silent. Then he leaped to where Raul stood and grabbed him by the throat. "I wasn't even here," Raul yelled, looking afraid. I'd never seen that before. Riley growled hideously and threw Raul as he'd thrown the speaker. Jen and Christy jumped out of the way again. Raul's body crashed right through the wall, leaving an enormous hole. Riley caught Kevin by the shoulder and with a familiar screech ripped off his right hand. Kevin cried out in pain and tried to twist out of Riley's grip. Riley kicked him in the side. Another harsh shriek, and Riley had the rest of Kevin's arm. He tore the arm in half at the elbow and threw the pieces hard at Kevin's anguished face. Smack, 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 like a hammer striking stone. "What is wrong with you?" Riley screamed at us. "Why are you all so stupid?" He made a grab for the blonde Spider-Man kid, but that kid leaped out of his way. His jump left him too close to Fred, and he stumbled back toward Riley again, gagging. "Do any of you have a brain?" Riley smacked a kid named Dean into the entertainment center, shattering it, and then another girl, Sarah, and tore her left ear and a handful of hair from her head. She snarled in anguish. It became suddenly obvious that Riley was doing a very dangerous thing. There were a lot of us in here. Already Raul was back, with Christy and Jen, usually his enemies, flanking him defensively. A few others banded together in clusters around the room. I wasn't sure if Riley was aware of the threat, or if his rant came to an end naturally. He took a deep breath. He tossed Sarah her ear and the hair. She recoiled away from him, licking the torn edge of her ear, coating it with venom so that it would reattach. There was no remedy for the hair, though. Sarah was going to have a bald spot. "Listen to me," Riley said, quiet but fierce. "All our lives depend on you listening to what I'm saying now, and thinking. We are all going to die. Every one of us, you and me too, if you can't act like you have brains for just a few short days." This was nothing like his usual lectures and pleadings for control. He definitely had everyone's attention. "It's time for you to grow up and take responsibility for yourselves. Do you think you get to live like this for free? That all the blood in Seattle doesn't have a price?" The little clusters of vampires no longer seemed threatening. Everyone was wide-eyed, some exchanging mystified glances. I saw Fred's head turn toward me in my peripheral vision, but I didn't meet his gaze. My attention was focused on two things. Riley, just in case he started to attack again, and the door. The door that was still closed. "Are you listening now? Really listening?" Riley paused, but no one nodded. The room was very still. "Let me explain to you the precarious situation we are all in. I'll try to keep it simple for the slowest ones. Raul, Christy, come here." He motioned to the leaders of the two largest gangs, allied for this brief moment against him. Neither of them moved toward him. They braced themselves, Christy baring her teeth. I expected Riley to soften, to apologize, to placate them and then persuade them to do what he wanted. But this was a different Riley. "Fine," he snapped. "We're going to need leaders if we're going to survive, but apparently neither of you is up to the task. I thought you had aptitude. I was wrong. Kevin, Jen, please join me as the heads of this team." Kevin looked up in surprise. He had just finished putting his arm back together. Though his expression was wary, it was also unmistakably flattered. He slowly got to his feet. Jen looked at Christy as if waiting for permission. Raul ground his teeth together. The door at the top of the stairs did not open.